Let us start. I guess it's really great to have you all here today, and I'm rarely have so enjoyable task because all of you are colleagues and good friends and people who can address these issues on multilateralism and the UN in very substantive way. And I think there is a time for clarity in speaking, and also clarity in thinking, because these two are interlinked. Major issues are at the stake, and we are now basically trying to see if we need just back to old good times, or it's a time to rethink some issues. And with this context, broader contextualization issues, I would like to invite Ambassador Brix, Emil, to give us your thoughts as a historian, diplomat, and now director of Vienna Diplomatic Academy, which is 250 plus years old. And you saw, your predecessors in the collective institutional history, so many challenges and many difficult times, many turning points. In your view, and for that I will also share share one background screen just to give the contextualization of the overall discussion. In your view, is this just the footnote in the global history, or is it the new page? How you, as a historian, diplomats, now trainer of diplomats, see this current moment, and how can we contextualize it? Over to you.
Thank you, Jovan. Well, it's too early to have a definite answer, as you know. But I think your picture of the Congress at Vienna is quite the right one. Actually, I'm sitting not far from where the original final contract of the Congress of Vienna is kept in storage in Vienna. I would say it is for politics, international politics, a chance to reconsider various things. For diplomats on a practical level, we tell our students here in Vienna that you have always been used to these sort of disruptions. Actually, I think it was you, Jovan, in one of your reports, you said diplomats are mediators of estrangement. And actually, that is what is right. So just think about the history of diplomacy. You see at least two things. You see on the one hand that diplomats always had to respond to fundamental changes, like restrictions in travel. I give you one Austrian example. Our first ambassador to Russia went there about 500 years ago to make negotiations on a war between the Habsburg monarchy and Poland, and Habsburg monarchy and Turkey. And when he arrived coming from Vienna, after half a year of travel to Moscow, the war with Poland was already over, and the war with Turkey, the Russians had already decided to go with the Turks. So as a diplomat, you have to be used to this sort of you might call it disruptions or whatever you call it. And the second point is, for real general changes from our historical perspective, it needs a disruption which is accepted to be a real game changer. And when you think about when were new international orders formed, so far it was always only after major wars. 1815, the Congress of Vienna, after the Napoleonic Wars, 1918-19, after the First World War, 1945, after the Second World War. And this was the only chance to form a new international system under very different, sometimes very different circumstances. And I recommend, if you look into how these major disruptions were responded to by diplomats, we can learn quite a thing. Just think about the question now after COVID, whether it is better if you are on site than not on site, or video nowadays, or maybe even not even invited. The the peace agreements after the First World War, without participation of the Habsburg territories, without participation of the Ottomans, the Germans, and so on, proved to be quite difficult to find, and they lasted only for about 20 years, let's say. After the Second World War, it was again a new system done by the victors. And when you talk about power nowadays, we have to say the members of the Security Council are not the most important and most powerful countries in this world, and so on and so on. So I'm not sure whether the COVID crisis is really a deep enough game changer to change the international system. But what I think we should look for is, if we believe in the multilateral system, Austria and others has invented this term of an effective multilateralism. I think this is actually nonsense, to be frankly speaking. What we have to look at is, do we have a stable and fair multilateral system? These are the two components we have to look at. Stable, I'm not sure whether we are in the situation of a stable multilateral system. As we all know, the relations between who is first, China or the US? Is the European Union only trying to wag the dog, or what is the situation there? And about fair multilateral system, it's the same problem. We don't have the idea that many of our regulations that we have are fair. So whenever we talk about changing the system, we should have always in the back of our mind, is it stable and is it fair, and what is the balance between these two things? So I would like to end with two maybe not so optimistic observations. One is from your questions, actually. You said, is there a chance for more than a usual reform reflex in the United Nations system? I would say, as long as the secretariats and the civil servants are concerned, yes. Because when there is a political will, the secretariats will follow suit. No problem at all. So that's what we have learned to do. And we will manage to do this. But the real question is of political will. There is a need of normative commitments to change. And there, I'm not so sure. I rather feel that, and you asked this so-called TELEP test, you called it. And my answer, as far as the United Nations system is concerned, that yes, the system is resilient, conservative, resilient, but the added value of the system decreases all the time. And there may come the point where the disruption will come because it's no longer a real added value. Sorry to be a bit provocative.
Thank you, Emil. Great. You started with avoiding the direct answer in the good Metternich tradition. And I thought it would go in that, but then you put another hat, your academic and historian hat, and really brought us a few key insights. Is this moment of disruption, COVID crisis? Most likely not. And the two criteria which are rarely found in literature, question of stability and fairness. And can we have both? Most likely, if I'm reading from your statement, most likely not. And what you said, and this is nice segue for the Monica's intervention, is how the system is reacting. You argue that system is ready for change, but political mentors may not be ready. There are some views that the system is not ready as well. But let's hear from Monica. Monica Ferro is the director of the UN Population Fund, and she has, in addition to being the international civil servant, she had a really interesting academic career. Therefore, Monica, could you put, again, like Emil did with a few hats, one of you being now insider in the system, and another being somebody who can step back and observe and see the answer to this question: is the UN system and machinery ready for change?
Thank you, Jovan. Well, first, thank you for inviting me, and then thank you for putting me on the spot. but I'm going to pick up where Ambassador Brix just left. And I actually thought he was optimistic because he acknowledged that there's a way out for the UN as long as there's political will. I agree with you, Ambassador. We are all ready to serve and to renew our commitment and also to serve under new guidelines. And you know, I was thinking when I saw the question from Jovan, I was thinking, you know, I taught the UN for many years, and in the beginning of every school year, of every academic year, I had a joke with my students. So I would tell them on the first class, those of you who can come up with an international, with an area of human activity for which I don't know an international organization, you'll get an extra point in the end of the semester. Never happened. They would come, you know, like postal regulations. There's an international organization for that. They would come with labor, with decent labor regulation. There's an organization for that. Human rights, peace and development, climate change, disease outbreaks. And this one came to my mind because of COVID. But I always had this question challenging of them, you know, understanding that multilateralism was set up to provide global solutions for global problems. But sometimes the achievements of multilateralism, they often went underappreciated and even taken for granted. And I think that if COVID allowed us to rethink multilateralism, was also with that concern on the back of our minds. We really understood that we need a multilateral system that's not only fit for purpose, because fit for purpose actually means not a lot. We need a multilateral system that's renewed, that's refreshed. And what I like to see in the way the multilateral system responded to COVID and responds to many, many challenges is by how the system was able to reinvent itself in the sense of looking at the way we work in a much more network manner. Everyone in the UN understood that we couldn't deliver on our mandate if we didn't partner with other international organizations, with civil society organizations, with financing institutions, with the private sector, with academia, because we were really eager for new thinking, new approaches. And I think that the added value of the UN it's pretty much intact. This idea that the UN can serve as the honest broker because of its political neutrality. Of course, we understand also, and I've seen the Secretary General mention this, that in some cases, what we see is that in some UN agencies or international organizations, there's a will to act, but the organization doesn't have teeth, doesn't have the claws necessary to lead the action. And in some cases where the organization actually has the teeth, it misses the political will. So I think that what COVID, if not the rebirth of the UN or not a completely disruptive moment, what it can provide us is with this clear idea that if we want to be seen as relevant, if we want to be seen as the system, as the global governance structure that can build back better, not only the services we provide, but ourselves, we really need first to do this new assessment of ourselves. We need a renewed multilateralism. We need a new way of work. And this, of course, doesn't come without pain, because if you analyze and if you evaluate the system, you will come to understand that some ways of work, the former normal, doesn't fit the new environment, doesn't fit the new demands. We have a civil society organization that's more critical in the sense of vital to our interests, but they are also very strong critiques. The way everything is scrutinized sometimes, and I don't want to bring this too much to the conversation, but how many times have we seen that the UN is portrayed in a way that's not even, I was going to say fair, but in a way that it's fake. Some of the asks we often get are not within our mandate, are not within our scope. As the ambassador was saying, some of the asks we are getting now, they depend on the political will. I don't like to see the UN as a sort of a sleeping beauty that needs the kiss of an external authority or external entity to wake up and deliver on what we are supposed to do. But in a way, we need to be challenged. We need to be guided, but we need also to create our own internal mechanisms. And I think, again, the Secretary General is really keen on this renewed multilateralism, on this networked way of working. And I can tell you that no agency is capable of delivering on the many demands we have now. And coordination doesn't come easy. Because we all have our way to work. And I'm being too critical of the UN. I know maybe I should have a more defensive posture on the favor of my own organization. But the truth is that we have our way to work. We have our own internal procedures. We have our own mechanisms. And in a way, to sit in a table and give up part of our autonomy to act to other partners doesn't come easy. It comes with some pain. It comes with some giving away in order so that the common operation is better than if each one of us acts alone. But I think that we are really now in a moment where the call, the ask is big. It's very visible. It's vital. And I'm also afraid that if we don't find a way to rebuild also the image of the UN in face to the public opinion or to the public audience, that multilateralism gains that we had and that were taken for granted, they may lose some of the momentum, or they may lose some of the traction. And if I may just add something, this also, I know that we have a lot of time to talk ahead of this, but some of the things that we feel also is that the way we work on multilateral settings has changed so much. Just the fact that we could no longer interact on a person-to-person basis during multilateral organizations. Sometimes a concept that is being politicized or it's being used in a way that evidence shows that that's not the right approach, let me say it this way. Sometimes if we are in the room, we can just break the myth or we can explain it properly. But now behind the screens, it's much more difficult to negotiate. And I think this will also have an impact on the way the UN decided to move along. I have much more to say, but I don't want to speak for too long because we will have time. Thank you, Jovan, for this.
Thank you, Monica, for this great. What I got from this, we are still, the verdict is the one question, one paradox is why we all, at all discuss multilateralism when there is a definitely need to manage global interdependence, from the fight against the move of viruses to the question of digital interdependence, trade, and other things. And one of the elephant in the room, small or big one, is this question of structural problems, or is it just the question of current political dynamics? And you more or less know what I'm referring to. This is one of the questions that we may come. And what you brought an interesting, we are developing, let's say, a dictionary. There was efficient multilateralism, which Emil questioned the fit to purpose. You also questioned a bit this slogan, build back better. This is a very controversial question in our discussion. Do we need really to build back better, or that's even language? I'm sure Marc, as a journalist, will reflect later on it. But let's move to New York. Vanessa, you're master of the international organizations. Vanessa Frazier is the ambassador of Malta to the UN in New York. You basically go and ask the international organization what to do. And Malta is a constructive player in multilateralism, keen to support multilateralism as a small state and also builder of the law of the sea and other issues. What is your view from connecting these academic reflections, historical machinery, reflections from machinery? How does it look from the perspective of the member state?
Well, let me just start by reminding that when there was a debate on we are celebrating this year the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. But during the commemoration of the 70th anniversary, Albright had said, if the UN didn't exist, we would have to invent it. And I think it is still true today. Although there is criticism, I think that it is still very, very valid. And for the 75th commemoration, the EU did have a statement and a position that we had that we had delivered about multilateralism, and we said that multilateralism could be facing a Darwinian moment. And I think it is true. It needs to evolve. It needs to adapt itself according to today's world and today's needs. And multilateralism needs to be fit for purpose, as we said before, in order to survive. But if you look at the final declaration of the 75th anniversary, which was in reality negotiated, I think, quicker and easier than was expected. And I think that maybe COVID helps in the goodwill around the table to negotiate the final declaration. We did say in it that there is no other global organization with the legitimacy, convening power, and normative impact as the United Nations. No other global organization gives hope to so many people for a better world and can deliver the future we want. The urgency for all countries to come together to fulfill the promise of the nations united has really been greater. That's taken right out of the final declaration for the 75th anniversary. And I think it is very true. I think it is the basis of it all. We have seen, I think in COVID, we have seen that multilateralism is very important. Simple bilateral action can never address the global challenges we are facing. And as a small country, we feel it even more, but the large countries feel it just as much. And, on issues like regional security, climate change, migration, clearly this cannot be done on a bilateral level. It has to be done on a multilateral level. And we need, however, processes that are able to respond more effectively. And this year, this has been discussed often in the United Nations, although this year we really had to do something about it because the UN has closed, as far as I know, and I'm not a multilateralist, that's all. I have been 28 years in diplomacy, but this is my first real multilateral post. But what I understand, the United Nations has closed only 3 times, 9/11 for a few days, Hurricane Katrina for a few days, and then during this pandemic for months. And we had to decide how we were going to ensure business continuity. And there, we really had to decide. It was a make or break moment. And now I'm speaking really as a perm rep, as one of the other 193, the feeling that we had around the table, it was when COVID started, so for the 74th session, which just ended now in September, we started the 75th, we were vice presidents of UNGA, which meant that I would sit on the general committee. It was the general committee that had to decide how we're going to have the processes, the business continuity, how we're going to meet, how we're going to debate, how we are going to agree on resolutions, how we're going to take decisions. And it wasn't something that we could just say, oh, okay, next week we'll be back. This was a pandemic that we didn't know it was going to end. And although we are now starting to meet in person, there are still very few in-person meetings. And we realize that the UN has to evolve. There's no other way about it. We saw how terrible to the image of the United Nations Security Council that they took so many months in order to agree to the global ceasefire call in a pandemic, the global ceasefire call made by United Nations Secretary General. When the United Nations Security Council resolution actually was agreed and came out, people didn't even think it was relevant anymore because it was 4 months later, 4 months after the call. After every single country had already individually tweeted their support for the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire, the Security Council still couldn't issue a resolution on it. So that does not help the image, definitely. And it's one of the reasons why many of the Security Council members were saying how important it was for them to meet in person, despite what was going on. It's a small group, should be able to meet with social distances, and the Germans, under their presidency, did ensure that meetings were held. we started, the GA was a hybrid in-person and not in-person, and we are meeting again. Now there is real discussion on possibility for e-voting, and this is not something new. It is something that the UN has discussed in the past, but now it is something we need to resolve. We know now that we have to have tools in our toolbox so that rather than being forced with our backs against the wall as we are now, but if we do manage to go back in person, and we do manage to work as we did in January, that we would have tools anyway in our toolbox, that if we're hit with this again, we're able to use straight away, because this year was very difficult. Here, as you probably know, resolutions were passed through silence procedure, which means that every country was given a veto. This is the thing, and that is unheard of in the United Nations General Assembly. I mean, one country can stop a resolution from 193, whereas normally you need a majority, right? So the silence procedure was great because it helps business continuity. And we're all proud of ourselves as we have passed, I don't know how many number now of resolutions during that time. But when you really nitpick at it, you realize how that it wasn't the right thing. It was the best that we could do at the time, the best solution that we could come up with. Also because that the procedure to take decisions by silence procedure also had to be a decision taken by silence procedure to start off with. You understand? So clearly the UN has realized with this pandemic that it needs to evolve. And as we said as the EU position was on multilateralism and on the 75th anniversary, this is a Darwinian moment for the UN, and this evolution is important. And I think the will is there. We have seen both in the 75th anniversary celebrations, the video messages sent by the various governments, the heads of governments, all committed themselves to multilateralism. Because even though there have been lots of individual talk of nationalisms and new borders and what have you during COVID, the reality is that every leader knows that bilateral relations aren't enough. Multilateral relations are very important in this globalized world. Our problems are becoming always more and more global, and we need global solutions for them, really. And it sounds like a cliche, but it's the truth.
Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. It's really great, rich reflection from the UN, the question of image, which was also mentioned by Monica, the question of perception, a bit of unfairness in the way how UN is judged. It should get a bit more benefit of doubt. You came with the toolbox, and it's interesting also, what are these new tools? And the silence procedure is universal veto. I never thought of this, but this is effectively that. And I would say underlying message is, yes, we need badly multilateralism. Multilateralism is functioning in spite of all critical views. Therefore, let's rebuild it. And I would say that from pessimism to optimism, our pendulum is moving, swinging, but now slightly moving towards optimistic scenario. But now we have a journalist. Marc Engelhardt came a few weeks to me and said, Jovan, could we have an interview on future of multilateralism at the UN? And Marc told me that he navigated quite a few organizations in Geneva, collecting his coverage for the Deutsche Welle, for the German radio. Marc, in what direction we should move? Towards optimism or pessimism, or stay somewhere in between? Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jovan, and thanks for introducing me as the pessimist. In a way, I must say I already learned a lot, and normally I listen to you guys and then I do my reporting. So I'm very thankful to be here, and I listened to a lot of people really here in Geneva during the past months, diplomats and people working for the UN, and the messages are really mixed. In a way, there is, this optimism. This pandemic shows us how necessary the UN really is, and multilateralism as such. And I think people really, a broad audience has listened to the WHO. Probably the public has noticed that it's still there and that it exists. And for, also diplomacy. People tell me, diplomats, that they really see the need to talk, but that's then one of the problems, and that's, I think, more than nostalgia, that the past months have shown that to really have talks, you need personal meetings, and you need to know and trust each other. And that's one thing I think that COVID has shown, that as fancy as these video conferences may be, they are not really a replacement for meeting personally, getting a feeling for the guy you're talking to, the diplomat, the ambassador from another country. And especially since summer, since many of the ambassadors' posts have changed here in Geneva, people more and more tell me, I'd like to talk to this and that guy, but I don't know him. And it's much harder to just pick up the phone and or request a Zoom meeting just to say hello. It doesn't happen. So what I really see is the problem of a lot of informal channels slowly drying away. And people are aware of that, and they say, we need to react somehow. But now comes the problem, how is somehow? And it's nice, Jovan, that you mentioned the build back better, because this is really a wording that has to come from the United Nations, because, it's just this build back better sounds so nice. But I think one of the questions really many governments are asking is, what can multilateralism in the future do for me and for my country? And well, I'm not a prophet, but I'm getting the feeling that if we are talking about the COVID vaccine and the distribution, this is not going to be the large hour of multilateralism, but this is rather going to be a very, very complicated stepping stone for international diplomacy. And one point where my feeling is I'm already seeing these problems is finance. And we have the debate at the moment about how will, for instance, human rights be financed in the next years. How will humanitarian work be financed even this year? And what we're seeing is it's the same old donors that are still giving money. 4 countries, 60% of OCHA's humanitarian budget, for instance. And I don't see, and neither do the people working in the system, see that change, just the opposite. The people I'm talking to are not afraid of COVID and what's happening now. They're afraid of what's happening after, when the economic crisis hits and when lots of governments are really going to refocus to home and to their countries. And maybe the last thing from media, in media terms, I already see this refocusing on national issues. The news are really focusing on what's happening at home. And of course, there's obvious reasons, the pandemic, most of all, then the fact that correspondents can't travel and they can't report from places far away. But I'm afraid, of course, as a foreign correspondent, this might get the norm. And people might just forget that there's, many countries out there where people have problems and where they need the international cooperation to get through. And I really, as you said, Jovan, I'm probably rather the pessimist than the optimist, and I don't see the obvious answers. I see that many diplomats are seeing the need to change, but I really don't see so many opportunities open at the moment.
Marc, you push the pendulum in the other direction with the very substantive points. I mean, the question of financing, the question of most likely complex negotiation around a viral or virus or vaccine multilateralism, and the overall question of which we underestimated, of shift of the public opinion towards the national issues, with the chief epidemiologists being the stars on the local national TVs. And that's really vital point, because once the global public space, it changes what people think about the priorities, it will affect the voting, it will affect the shaping of foreign policy issues. Thank you for bringing this element. And possibly I can see a gap which we can cover in discussion between need for multilateralism and really reality, which is more realpolitik, and how I think in collective sort of brainstorming, we can come to it. Now, I'm on the edge of becoming persona non grata at Diplo, because I just got a comment that we should make a coffee break. But my reading of the pulse of the room is at least that the discussion is going very nice, and we should make interruption. Let's centralize discussion among the panelists. Are you that we continue? It's my vote. What about Vanessa? Voting, no objections. Okay, we go it. You see how I'm forcing the votes, you know, in this way. But now I have excuse in front of Katarina Hoyne, who basically why I changed the rules. Now, we have so many interesting threads on language, on optimism, on the gap between real need for multilateralism and reality. And our next speaker is Richard Hill. Richard Hill has been wearing so many hats, from the MIT doctorate in MIT in statistics via HP person to ITU. I will miss something, to person who basically was one of the key critical thinkers about e-voting system in Geneva on technical basis. And he has been bridging this gap between technology and policy a lot. And in addition, Richard is involved quite a lot in the question of functioning of organization. I don't know, Richard, you can address all of these aspects. What you are going to pick from this rich menu that we outlined so far?
Great, okay. So I'm going to be really pessimistic, much more than the other speakers, even though I do agree with basically everything that's been said, and I do believe that we should have a strong multilateral system, and the world will only get better if we find win-win solutions at a global level, which we're failing to do right now. My opening is actually pretty much the same as Ambassador Brix's, and we didn't coordinate. It's just we had the same view of the world. Basically, multilateralism has come out of major catastrophes, in particular wars. I would trace it back to the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the horrible European 30 Years' War. And then I'll skip forward to the League of Nations, which came after the First World War, and the United Nations, which came after the Second World War. But what is, you know, a multilateral system? It's a willingness to get rid of some sovereignty. And let's not go into what those were, but basically that's what it's about. And this willingness weakened after the First World War, which is why we had the second one. And it seems to be weakening after the Second World War, but particularly with the end of the Cold War. With the end of the Cold War, now we've seen this resurgence of nationalism. And that, of course, leads to weakening of the multilateral system. Now, some people say, oh, but that's because of these nasty people, Trump, Salvini, Orban, Johnson, Bolsonaro, whatever, you know, the list is as long as you like it to be. In my view, that's a symptom, not a cause. Those people are being voted into power because things are not working. And what we need is not speeches full of platitudes, but real action. So we need to walk the talk and not just talk it. That's an old Vietnam era American expression. So I'll take one example, the current pandemic, which really puts a lot of these things into focus. The most serious challenge to a coordinated multilateral approach to this crisis is the insufficient support from member states and a highly politicized global context, which makes it difficult to make concessions. World Health Organization actually has the mandate to prevent and to mitigate things like this. And there's a treaty on it, the International Health Regulations. Much of what I'm saying now is actually perfectly consistent with an excellent paper, or it's not a paper, it's an article, which is referenced in footnote 11 of the Diplo report for this conference, and I'll post the URL on the chat. But why is it, we all could see World Health Organization is not leading, right? And nobody says, oh, we're going to do this because the World Organization said to do it. I mean, some countries are, but the big developing countries are not doing that. On the contrary, some of them are criticizing World Health, and it's not just the United States, others are criticizing. It's not because the staff is incompetent, but it's because, first of all, the budget is totally inadequate. And second, member states are unwilling to delegate authority to WHO. For example, they say Tedros declared the pandemic too late. Well, guess what? Tedros doesn't get to declare. He simply reproduces and makes public what a committee of experts named by the member states have decided. So the committee of experts was hesitant to declare a pandemic, so Tedros can't declare a pandemic, even though he might have wanted to. The budget, it's ridiculous. The budget of the World Health Organization is the same as the budget of the Geneva hospital. Geneva is a city of 500,000 people. So that's a joke, right? And it's much smaller than the budget of the US Center for Disease Control. I forget whether it's 1/10 or 1/3 or something like that. But it's just, there's no scale, no comparable thing. So everything is controlled by the member states. And we've seen with the pandemic that the member states are actually less willing to cede authority. Even just look at the level of the European Union and how it's handling the pandemic. They can't agree on very much, and it's not the European Union doing anything. And there doesn't seem to be much of a push to go in the other way. So the reform that is needed is for states to work in good faith to strengthen the multilateral system. But unfortunately, I don't see any indication that that will happen. Ambassador Brix mentioned the idea that we need something that's bad enough to be a game changer. Well, unfortunately, I don't think that the pandemic is bad enough, which is horrible, right? Because it's really bad, but maybe it's not bad enough. Some of you probably know the work of Piketty, the economist. By analogy to him, I would say that things will not change unless we get a major catastrophe. And it probably has to be worse than the current pandemic. Again, that's very depressing. Hopefully, we're not going to have another world war, because as Einstein said, whatever weapons we use for World War III, we're pretty sure that the next one would be fought with sticks and stones. So let's hope we don't go there. Now, I did want to give the positive suggestion, though. So I don't see a way out, but I do see something that can help. And that's very much along the lines of what Jovan and others have mentioned. Let's try to build a digital home for the United Nations, understood as a dedicated, purpose-built, open source platform for online meetings and negotiations. And I think that out of the pandemic, at least we can get an agreement to do that, because that's an obvious step that will help things out in the future. And then hopefully all my pessimism will be proven false. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Now, Vanessa and Monica, you have to push the pendulum back to more optimistic scenario. That was a mix of optimistic and realistic reflections from Richard, especially almost shocking the statistics that WHO budget is equal to the Geneva hospital. That's really, really shocking. And I think for communication from the UN, we need this type of information. I read somewhere that complete UN budget is equal of the budget of Los Angeles City Council. That I don't know why UN doesn't communicate that type of information with people can see in a more direct way. What Richard, what you mentioned in particular, you are closer, let's say, to Monica and Vanessa reflections that machinery is ready, it is competent, it can deliver, but the question is of the political will and masters. You see the major problem on that. There is also a question of the reform of the UN. Is it just a ritualization of the narrative, or do we need? I'm not speaking about Security Council. I'm speaking about machinery of the UN. And these are the issues which we are going to reflect. Now, what we are going to do now, we'll hear from Katarina, who is following a text chat. But in the meantime, you can take any of these points which we have underlined and reflect on them. And we have a really rich menu. And on the question of gap between need for multilateralism and obvious crisis. The question, is it the question of political masters, member states, or the system? Do we need a big major catastrophe to do rebooting, or we can change UN through evolution? Those are few issues that have been emerging. Katarina, could you tell us what's going on in text chat?
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you very much for a very interesting session. I really enjoyed it. Yes, we have received a number of questions, and here are some of them. Emmanuel Muzingvani, I'm so sorry if I pronounced your name in a wrong way. He would like to know what is the impact of the veto power among the permanent member states of the UN Security Council on the UN and multilateralism. In addition, he would like to know to what extent are individuals able to represent themselves in the multilateral system. He made reference to protest and Twitter hashtags. And are these drawing any multilateral action? Then Deepak, he would like to know how do you see the role, functioning and financing of other multilateral institutions outside the UN, such as the World Bank Group, WTO, etc. And in relation to Monica Ferro's reference to the number of UN organizations, Elena Rubinsky was wondering if a restructuration of the number of the programs and organizations, as well as their scope and authority, would be relevant, and more broadly, should a deep change and regroupment of the UN should be engaged, and by whom? And last but not least, Elena would also like to know how could we increase the funding for organizations when the tendency is to reduce budgets? So that will be all from my end. Thank you very much.
But therefore, the question of financing is emerging. I think what Marc put it on the agenda now, and it's now picking up. What I suggest now, we have these questions, these three questions from our text chat. Any of you can pick these questions and also reflect on any point from discussion that I outlined. We may start with Emil. Any question? Maybe the question of impact of UN veto powers on the UN reform and the overall UN system, or any other reflection.
Yeah, thank you, Jovan. I was about to reply to the veto power question. I think the veto power issue is a question of stability of the system. It helps to keep the system stable, but it makes it quite immobile at the same time. So there is one of these real dilemmas we have in the system. I think changing the system of the Security Council would be vital for making also the system maybe more fair, but all the multilateralists around the globe know much better than I do that there is no chance at the moment to change this system for the Security Council, in spite of all the proposals from the secretariats, from diplomats, and so on. I would like also to maybe say a few words about economic global governance. We didn't speak so far about that, but that's actually the crucial point in the future. Because when we look at it from a point of view of realpolitik, economic global governance issues are much more important than what in the general bubble of the UN system is happening. And I'm especially calling it a bubble, the UN system, because this is the perception, unfortunately, of many people nowadays. And it was mentioned the example of WHO, where a lot of good work is being done, but it's actually not really known to be a decisive factor in the COVID crisis. And the point I want to take up from the discussion so far is on nationalism. I like to defend what's happening nowadays. I'm certainly not a nationalist, I'm very European-minded. But just let me say, in cases of these sort of crises, it seems to be the most popular reaction, not only by politicians, but by the public, to refer to the one organization they trust most, and which is in most cases the state. Mm-hmm. It's the own nation. We saw it, actually, I think all of us, maybe with the exception of Belarus and some other examples, that people referred back to the state. So that is, I'm not so sure that the COVID example will give us a chance to ask for more global responses to crisis. because many people will say, actually, we learned again that the health system and the whole trust system, our contrat social, is based on the nation state. And the second point in favor of nationalism, unfortunately, is the issue of democracy. It seems to be very obvious that still the idea of how democracy works is mainly an idea which was started in states, in nation states, and up to nowadays, it's working best. It's not working everywhere, as you know, but it's working best on the level of a nation state, where there is some homogeneity also. And as we all know, democracy is quite a foreign vocabulary to international organizations, even to the European Union, as we all know. So I'm a bit, unfortunately here, I'm again, not purely an optimist, but I give you one example from my time in Moscow again. I asked Sergei Lavrov once, when there was a sort of almost breakthrough in the Syrian negotiations, whether he is an optimist, and he looked at me and said, I am not paid for to be an optimist. So there is a realpolitik around all of us. In spite of my hope for a better normal, I would say pragmatic steps to improve the system and make it some more perceptive to what's happening outside the bubble is something we should aspire for.
Great. Emil, let me just quickly share one element that can inspire this realpolitik which you mentioned, and I think that's very. I guess you can see the screen, and it's linked to your question of changing economic governance. We compare the revenue and GDP. GDP of Austria is just 1.6 higher than the revenue of Amazon.
Still greater.
Still greater.
It will change.
And then if you see, let's say Vanessa from a small country, obviously Malta is the revenue of the bookings.com. And not only Malta, Albania, Armenia, Benin, Brunei, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Madagascar, Mauritius, Mongolia, Mozambique, much bigger countries in terms of population than Malta. But that question is sometimes forgotten, that economic power, especially during the COVID crisis, has been really changing the geoeconomics and geopolitics. Mm-hmm. And you have, for example, Switzerland is like Austria, close to the Amazon. Microsoft is as strong as Slovakia. And this is the underlying shift which will continue with the pandemic and crisis. And then we should keep that in mind, that element of realpolitik, in addition to these elements that you mentioned, anchoring of people into what they know and that they can rely on. It's national state. Religion is, to the large extent, didn't provide this sort of anchoring point. Now, I will wait for others to join, but here is a short intervention by Khalid Fatal. Khalid is the tech specialist from Middle East, from Lebanon, who has been reflecting a lot on the UN and can we fix the UN? Khalid, what is your take on it?
Jovan, thank you very much for bringing me in to add my 2 cents. One thing that I need to be very clear on, I'm not an optimist, I'm not a pessimist, I'm a realist. And I think a reality check is significantly in order. The COVID-19 global pandemic proved to be the ultimate exposure of governments' failures, as well as the multilateral systems failure, especially those of Western democracies. Now, it exposed exactly what Emil was talking about and some of your other guest speakers. It exposed the frailty and systemic failure and injustice of our current global political and economic, as well as democratic order, to the detriment of people's lives and livelihoods. Putting it in context, we need to ask ourselves, when we use the term the UN needs to evolve, when we say we need to update, we're assuming that the system is fixable. And I'm not saying it's not fixable, but the solution is needed yesterday. There's no time for initiatives and consultations and 5-year plans and 10-year plans. People are dying, and the economic condition today is at such a level that the survivability we talk about is not just on governments and organizations, it's people. People are struggling to survive, really. So if the system hasn't been able to actually deal with what we call a mitigatable threat, this was precedented. It was not unprecedented. So how is the system? How are these governments? How is this order? How is the multilateral system capable to deal with the combination of many unprecedented threats? For example, the geopolitical warfare today that's politically motivated to coerce and change the direction of economic and political directions of nations. What about fake news, false narratives, special interests, election meddling, global elitism? Some people like to call it racism and global racism. I call it global elitism, and that's centuries old. The system itself has failed to produce the solution needed. The challenge that I see is, and I call this, by the way, as early as back in March, I said, the world we've known will not return the way we've known it. However, there is a great opportunity for it to be a better world. It can't happen by itself because the current powers that control the way things happen will ensure we tweak the system, modify it, and then call it real change and then sell it to the public, and we'll see a little change on that. We've seen these examples after the financial crisis. We've seen it after numerous events. And the global pandemic was prepared for. George W. Bush laid a strategy for that. Obama did the same thing. How effective was it in delivering these solutions to the American people, for example, on and also to the globe? So what I would like to do is consider me as the realist, but at the same time, the curveball. We need to challenge ourselves that we need to have solutions that can work. And the key part I would conclude with this is, if the UN is incapable, if the multilateral system is incapable to make itself relevant as a solution moving forward, then it will become a dinosaur in the 21st century. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Khalid.
Could I come in quickly, Jovan?
Great comment from the Middle East, where Khalid is from Lebanon and Syria, where things are really happening. And when we saw in Beirut the big failure of government, especially with the explosion and what's happened in it. But I guess
quick comment, if I may, Jovan. Although I was born in the Middle East, I left the Middle East more than 45 years ago, and I live in the West.
Yeah.
The fundamental point: this is a global problem that manifests itself in different ways in different countries, and the solution needs to be there needs to be a much greater sense of urgency on fighting something that works. Because so far,
your comments remind me of a friend of mine who said, I felt comfortable as long as we knew that people in the Balkans was in a mess. But now he was really horrified when he realized that the whole world is in a mess. That's the great thing. Richard, to you.
Yeah, just very quickly, I'd like to really associate with both what Emil said and what Khalid said. Now, Emil, I think that you really had an excellent description of what we call in science the ist, the German word ist, the way things are. But I'd like to focus on the soll, the way things should be. And I agree, in order to have a working multilateral system, we need much more democracy in the multilateral system. We don't have time now to do that, but I have some ideas which could be explored. And in terms of people living in the nation state, unfortunately, the nation state, as Khalid correctly said, has also failed to deal with the pandemic very well. And as we know, something like a majority, probably, of the American people are going to vote Trump out of office, at least in part, because they didn't like the way he handled the pandemic. I would submit that actually the nation states failed to handle the pandemic very well, precisely because of the weakness of the multilateral system. If we'd had a strong reaction, then probably we would have done much better with the pandemic, and the nation states would be better off and would be more trusted. So I'm kind of looking at what we should do and not the mess we're in.
Thank you, Richard, on this should element. Let's go, Monica. Monica, back to you. You gave the critical reflection on the UN and the crisis, but you were more optimistic on the way that things can be improved and done better. Khalid came with a really challenging question if the UN can be fixed and the urgency of fixing the UN. Monica, what can you pick from this discussion and these different trajectories that we have been opening?
Well, yeah, I think it was, it's been very rich, very, and the fact that we share a common concern with different perspectives, it's always very, very nice. And I'm going to pick up on the optimistic, not optimistic thing. I always tell my friends that I'm an informed optimistic, and sometimes very challenging to distinguish an informed optimistic from a pessimistic. But I'm optimistic, but I'm informed. I just want to add two small things. First, Marc was saying that no one is asking now because of COVID and the restriction measures. No one is having courtesy calls by Zoom. I just had one before this meeting. This is why I was almost late. I had a courtesy call with the new ambassador that just arrived in Geneva. And we both admitted it was the first time we were doing it. And also it's kind of strange not seeing the person that you're going to have to work with. But I think that the setup is in place, as Richard was saying. We have the infrastructure. And if I may say this, one of the few silver linings I saw in COVID was how all of a sudden I could put up a panel with youth activists from the 4 continents, which I could never do it because it was always an issue to allow them to travel. Some of them are underage. They would have to come with someone escorting them. So it was always hyper complex. And now all we need to make sure is a secure internet line so they can join in and to make it dynamic. So, but admit it, for me, it's the only silver lining because I really miss the social interaction. But I would like to say that on multilateralism, I think that we need to learn how to communicate better. We often talk to each other in a different language. You talk about the bubble, what about the jargon? I can, sometimes I sit in conversations that I've joined the UN 3 years ago, and sometimes I still sit in conversations where I don't understand what's going on because we all talk in acronyms. So, okay, it's easier if we talk in acronyms, but then we have this very long expressions that for most people, they mean very little. And allow me to put another hat that it's not relevant for this. Before joining the UN, I was a parliamentarian. And one of the things that was sometimes hard to explain to my constituency was why I, a Portuguese parliamentarian, was so engaged in a working group in an international organization that they didn't even know it exists. They couldn't understand the work they were doing it. So I think that it's up to us, because it takes 2 to tango, it's up to us to explain better to people what we do and what we do with taxpayers' money. And I think it's this sense of ownership that our taxpayers have to have on the work of the UN. So I think that it's not that multilateralism needs to be fixed. We need to explain better what we do. We need to work better together. And one of the questions that was that Katerina was raising, do we work together? Because you probably go to a country and you will see 4 UN agencies doing precisely the same. And it's often because we have mandates that touch upon each other, but sometimes because we get financing for a specific project with no flexibility. And this makes, for us, the UN, sometimes even difficult to coordinate. So what a couple of UN agencies that share the same executive board, and I'm going to give you my example, the United Nations Population Fund, UNICEF, UNDP, and UN Women, because we have the same board and so we came up with a common chapter to our strategic plans where we promised to plan together, deliver differently, and report together. So it's a way of, in our decision-making forum, we coordinate so that we don't overlap, because there's something that's never too much, or there's never enough in international organizations. That's funding and political will. So I think that in a way we need to better showcase what we are doing, but we need also to take a look deep inside and understand how we can better serve the people and how we can better or we can be more efficient. And I understand that the representation of people, which was another question, was always a big thing. I often got questions from my students or from electors that would send me emails asking me, how can I make sure that my voice is heard in the UN? Of course, you have civil society representation in ECOSOC and in many forums, but the UN needs to be more agile in this conversation. This is why this huge consultation on the future we want, the UN we want, really try to reach out to people. And how efficient that was, I have a positive evaluation of it. But the test is going to be now how much we can implement on those decisions. And the reform of the UN has been something that was already touched upon here, not only the veto, but the overall process. But I would look broad and really convey the message of urgency. We need to urgently renew the way multilateralism is being not only communicated but working also.
There were Monica sharing with Khalid the question of urgency, his point that we need to act, and I think underlying theme, you obviously think that it is a fixable problem. The question of finances, better communication, and I'm involved in digital politics, and one issue which is very simple issue which governments and the UN cannot answer. If Zoom decides to cut now the most important talk, or if you let's say you were parliamentarian and you were convincing your young citizens to start the business in Portugal, which is doing, by the way, excellent in the e-business, and somebody opens YouTube business, and YouTube decides at some point to cut access to that person or to that service. And he comes to the parliament or to the Ministry of Economy and like, hey, by the way, you told me during the election campaign to start the business, I started the business, I'm now economically ruined. Governments cannot deliver, at least in digital field, they cannot deliver on the basic social contract. And this is a huge problem. Whether it is cybersecurity, whether it is e-commerce and the other thing. I'm familiar with this field, and we have a lot of rhetorics, as Monica, you mentioned, in digital field, which nobody understands. And the point is very simple. Can citizens of Geneva or Vienna, if they are attacked, or Malta, go and call somebody and say, hey, I'm attacked in cyberspace. Can you fix, can you find who did it? And can you recover my assets? Or can you call this YouTube and make sure that I continue with my business? I'm just mentioning a few examples, but there are many. But this is a very valid point of that link, which is ultimately very simple. People will come and they will talk and they will be engaged and involved if they see the purpose and the reason. They won't just come for the sake of the empty general promises. Vanessa, so rich offer on the table. How would you create this? We should start making salad. The ingredients are there. What would you put in these ingredients that we can use in order not to starve in the coming years?
That's very interesting that you use the salad, actually, because I use the sandwiches, sandwich analogy when people ask me what is the role of a diplomat. But that's we'll have to discuss another time. But I say we make sandwiches. And we have all the different ingredients, and we use different ingredients to make these different sandwiches. There is stuff that we can do. I mean, even going back to what we were talking about, the veto before, clearly there needs to be reform of the UN, and it needs to be more representational than it is now. And the Security Council needs to be more representational. But adding permanent seats with vetoes in our position is not the right way to reform it. If we are saying one of the problems of the United Nations is the veto, then I don't think adding to it will help. So just to close, to have my 2 cents worth on what was said before, basically, Malta is part of the group when it comes to the UN Security Council reform called United for Consensus, where we believe, we think it's the group that will find the most consensus, basically, because it is most realistic. It's not increasing the permanent membership, but increasing the elected membership. And by increasing the elected membership, you make it more geographically representational. of the UN today, like, you know, more African groups. In our proposal, there's also a seat for SIDS, for example. So small island development will have a seat rather than have to contest for the seat within their geographical family. So it just becomes more, the elected membership is more representational, and it dilutes the power of the veto. And then there are other parallel initiatives to dilute the power of the veto. There's one specifically led by Liechtenstein, which calls for a meeting of the General Assembly within 2 weeks of the use of any veto in order to discuss why the veto was used. Not to change it, but to discuss why the veto was used. So there are some initiatives, because realistically speaking, the current Security Council, to change the Security Council, you would require the consensus of all the members, and these members wouldn't vote for change. So
you add a bit of a spice into our salad. Definitely not the Russian salad; it's more Macedonian salad. Now appearing. Vanessa, and one body which Malta has been promoting in the past, which may have some role to play, is the trusteeship council, which is now dormant body in the UN system. But there were discussions to have it trust for the future generation.
Yes, and really, I have to say, you see behind me, and we have our candidate chair for Security Council 23-24. We have launched our campaign this September, although we had announced our candidature 10 years ago. We're now officially in campaign, and in his video message to the general debate of the General Assembly, our Prime Minister did end his final sentence of his video message was launching our campaign. And going back to the Trusteeship Council, when Guido De Marco, former President of Malta, Guido De Marco, was President of the General Assembly, he did have a lot of discussions about the possible reform of the Trusteeship Council. And I have to say that whilst you will not see it in our campaign brochure, you know, whoever's watching here will have a little secret thing we have up our sleeve, is to reconsider and to reconnect to this idea. We do feel that there are some reforms that need to be done. The Trusteeship Council currently doesn't really have a mandate. Its meeting is 5 minutes long just because it needs to have this annual meeting in order to continue its existence. But we feel that we can fill the agenda with something for it. And there are some issues that could be placed in trust for the Trusteeship Council. And specifically, I am currently co-chair of SIDS with Antigua and Barbuda. We started this year as a 2-year chairmanship. And we have an idea to evolve some of the SIDS concerns, which may end up being something of concern for the Trusteeship Council. I can't really say more at the moment because it's something we are developing and which we want to keep for our Security Council mandate, but it is attached, obviously, to security, because that's Security Council, and to be attached also to our priorities for Security Council, which are oceans and climate. You know, so you have an idea there what we're talking about. There are some bodies which can be reformed in the UN and can evolve. As I said earlier, this Darwinian moment. Let's evolve them to today's needs. Let's not dismantle them, but not leave them there for nothing. Let's evolve their use to be used for, you know, to cover today's needs.
Thank you, Vanessa. Well, you add the spice. Now you tell us you make our appetites to wait for a Maltese participation Security Council.
You're going to have to follow our campaign in order to see it evolving. And I hope that the DiploFoundation will be involved in our campaign. We'll talk about that later privately, Jovan, but I definitely think that it will be very good to have synergies.
We have Switzerland and Malta as candidates, our two funding states,
exactly.
And that could be an interesting participation in Security Council.
Exactly, and I see that you have Jörg as one of your speakers also. In other panels we had spoken about this. It's very important.
Let's move with our salad. Thank you, Vanessa. Analogy to Marc. Marc, what would you add to this salad? And I will ask others to to add some ingredients into this, and with this we will conclude the session. Marc, please go ahead.
I'll add a pinch of salt, probably. I know. Sorry, since you said, Vanessa, a Darwinian moment, and I think that's probably something I also would like to add. What I'm really seeing is there is going to be more power play at the United Nations again, and there's probably going to be more thinking in the way of we've seen in the Cold War period of blocks. And that must not necessarily be a bad thing. It's not what I'm wishing for. But when you talk to developing countries, for instance, they say, well, you know, in the Cold War, we had much more influence back then because either the one side or the other, they needed us. And that's probably what might happen in the next months and years after COVID. So what I'm seeing here is rather a Darwinian moment of the wrong kind. But in that way, also an opportunity if you think about what can we do with this situation. And that's maybe the big fear I'd really like to add, because we've been asked one of the chat messages here on financing of organizations. And I know you were probably talking about UN organizations, but one of the real big worries I'm seeing here is that civil society is losing money at the moment and is losing influence. And it's totally right, as as Vanessa said before, that you can invite many people, or Monica said that you can invite everybody on a Zoom conference, but there's just an oversupply of Zoom conferences at the moment. And what civil society really needs is direct influence to government officials, for instance, at a summit. And that has really, it has not been there in the past months. And I think that's something we won't see returning very fast or very soon.
Therefore, I'm trying to distill the ingredient, but basically we need money for a good ingredients and good meal. The question of financing is extremely important, and this is a problem that we are noticing, that all promises of multi-stakeholderism are basically dying. We'll wait for two ingredients from quick ingredients from the Khalid, Richard, and Emil. You coming from the city with a great cuisine from Vienna, you have to give us the final dressing for discussion, and we'll conclude the session with this. Khalid, over to you.
Thank you, Jovan. I'll make it very, very brief. I like the concept of the salad and the ingredients. I think, first of all, to be pragmatic and realistic, I think there is definitely a role for the UN, but it needs to make itself relevant, not to itself, not to the people who actually give it its value or its raison d'etre. It's to the people. So the ingredient I would challenge everybody to factor into this is the citizen, the people, because democracy is in stage 4 cancer. And I don't say it's dead, because if it says dead, there's nothing to revive. But because it's in stage 4 cancer, we have an imperative and an obligation, all of us, within our own sphere of influence, what we can do to engage the public, because they will be the force that will change the way of thinking of the politicians to do the right thing. Otherwise, we'll all end up in the dustbin of history, unfortunately, and I hope that doesn't happen. And by the way, I talk about this in my book. This is not a plug for my upcoming book, Survivability. But the concept here is it's about changing mindsets, changing modalities, and working with what can work, not what has been inherited from the days of the dinosaur.
Thank you. Thank you. I expected some hummus or some sort of some more elements, but thank you for this important ingredients. We are hearing in the chat from the Ayman, who is based, I guess, Ayman in Beirut. Very interesting comments. Now, for ingredients, we have a final dressing from Emil. Otherwise, I will be in trouble because I skipped the coffee break. But now, if I extend the session beyond 15 minutes, then I'm definitely becoming persona non grata. Emil, help me with some nice dressing for today's discussion.
Jovan, the problem is we Austrians like to have the salad finished and eat it already. So we're not for putting things, but for eating a salad. But if you ask me really, what a good salad needs, needs is oil. It needs something that brings things together and can mix them up. So I would try to bring in the oil. And I think this is the optimistic part. The only optimistic part of my interventions is that there's a chance for the oil, because I think the system, the secretariats, they are there. They are ready for the change. But as I think all of us said, the problem is the political will. And here I have to stop. We talked about the Darwinian moment. And in the European Union, we now, in the last 1 or 2 years, some people talk about the Hamilton moment of Europe, but it's not there. And there is certainly no Hamilton moment for the United Nations system. But what we would need something like this, and to be as radical as possible in the proposals we make. So I propose that think tankers, practitioners, also come up with radical demands, because basically, Jovan, I'm an Austrian, and Austrians are all anarchists. So we believe sometimes you have to put the bomb into things. And my final sentence, sorry to be Austrian again, we have the most pessimistic slogan that ever existed, that is Austrian, when we say the situation is hopeless but not serious.
Oh,
Thank you for the invitation.
Emil, I can see that Austria had a strong influence on the Balkans with a few elements from final elements from your side. It was really great pleasure and honor. I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm selfish that I like to enjoy the session which I moderate. A lot of interesting elements from slogans, fit to purpose, efficiency, multilateralism, build back better, Darwinian, Hamiltonian moment. Katarina will have very easy task to write a really interesting report. I'm sure that Marc, you got some ideas for your coverage for Deutsche Welle. And thank you for sharing with us this 1 hour and 23 minutes. Have a nice day, Vanessa in New York, and the rest of you, nice evening with a nice salad and some good wine. And there will be a chance for the better world, at least with some wine, and we'll continue these discussions. Have a nice rest of the day. All the best. Bye.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Well done.